Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Art Business Podcast. And my guest today is an alumna of the MA Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art, where, just to remind you, I'm the program director of that program, have been for over 20 years. I've seen Aryana Khan, our guest today. I've seen a lot of alumni, students coming through the course, and many of them end up staying in London and working in the art world in London. And Aryana is one of those, and she has worked in several very, very interesting art businesses since she graduated. So, as usual, I'm going to just start by welcoming Aryana. You're very welcome today.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be on. It's exciting.
And I'm just going to get the ball rolling and break the ice, as it were, by asking about, your favorite city and any reasons why that might be.
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, before I tell you about my favorite city, I have to say I'm surprised that it's been 20 years at the Institute, because you look exactly the same. So whatever you're drinking there, it's working.
It's probably that I'm not drinking that is doing the trick.
My favorite city, well, I might be a little biased. I've been now in London since, I think, 2012, 2013, and I really don't think there's any city like it. I think I couldn't even say it's a love-hate relationship. I love it. I think, like most people, it can be very hectic, but when I leave, when I go back to sort of California, the Bay Area, where I spent 6 formative years in my life, San Francisco, LA a little bit. I love being there in the sun, but I always miss London. I grew up in the Gulf, in the Middle East, Dubai, Kuwait, and London is up there. I mean, of course, I like to holiday in Rome and various other cities, but yeah, I think London.
But what is it about London?
I mean, I think you have everything at your fingertips. You have an incredible art scene, and I know this is sort of going to be a lot of what we speak about, but the galleries, the museums, I mean, we have incredible museums, and we almost take it for granted. I take it for granted. On a weekend, you can just go to the National Gallery, you can go to the V&A, you can just walk around Soho, and there's I spent some time in Fitzrovia earlier this week with a gallerist who's opening up a new space. So there's more galleries that are popping up in London. You go to East London, and there's it's like being in a different world almost. So I think it's that. I think it's the people. You meet so many people, and I think the MAB program is such a great example of that. You have people that are based in London, but also that come from around Europe, around the entire world, really. So you get this amazing mix of culture, of perspectives. There's nowhere else like it.
Yeah, as a teacher, I love the kind of excitement of students who don't really know London, or sometimes they've never been here. And I always regret that I know it, because it's like when you go to a new city, it's so exciting. Yeah. And it's very hard to kind of see through the glasses that they're seeing through, which I'd love to be able to do. But to be honest, I don't tire of London either. I find it continually exciting and absorbing, even though I've known it most of my life. So it does seem to have something, and sometimes I wonder what it is in London, because obviously when you live in a place, as you kind of begin to see maybe the negatives and the problems of a city more than a visitor might see, if you like. But I think it's definitely the gallery. It's not just, as you say, those public galleries. It's the fact that there are all these amazing commercial galleries and startup galleries with amazing new artists on show, and there's areas of London where that becomes part of the culture and the cafe culture. Yeah,
totally. I think it's about, I think at the end of the day, any city that you're in, you can tire of it, and the onus is on us to kind of see things anew every time we go around. And I think what's great also about London is you get these different pockets, right? So I sort of touched upon East London, but you can walk around Little Venice, and it's a certain kind of energy. I don't know, I was walking from Frieze offices the other day to watch a film screening at, the British Film Institute. And that's a whole sort of other cultural area. We talk about the arts, but, performing arts, music, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in many ways, I find it frustrating because I miss things. I get alumni saying, "Please come to my gallery opening exhibition," and I look at my diary and I can't make it, and I'll say, "Oh, I'll drop in." Then I realize 4 weeks later I haven't done that. I have to say an apology.
It's almost that there's too much happening.
In some ways, but it seems to thrive and it seems to cope from having too much in some ways.
Yeah.
So that's really good. Are there any kind of favorite buildings like are you into architecture, or don't you really think about buildings and architecture?
I mean, I love beautiful things. I think London, well, as most of us probably do, that's a really, general thing to say. I spent some time, where was I? In Prague, architecturally, I think stunning. As far as buildings, well, I can't say that the building that we're in is especially beautiful. Have you been to 180 House or 180 Strand?
This is in the
Near
Strands, near for listeners who don't know London so well. Strands is a quite historic road by the River Thames that used to have a lot of townhouses, like for aristocratic people, used to be along that riverbank by the Strand. I think the word Strand actually was when the Anglo-Saxon settlements were here. They moved out of the collapsed Roman early medieval London, which collapsed basically the walls and everything. And the archaeological evidence suggests they moved to the Strand, which is, I think, Anglo-Saxon for beach. So you can imagine the River Thames used to be broader, and it was like an area that was on a beach on the Thames. But your building in the Strand, no, I haven't been there. Maybe you could.
Well, I should definitely invite you, which I will. But it's right next to Somerset House, which is, I think, beautiful. Has a wonderful inner courtyard, and I think there's an ice skating.
18th century survival as well. Yeah.
Well, this one is slightly newer, and I wouldn't say it was beautiful, but I would say what goes on inside it is very interesting. It's I only joined Frieze a year and a few months ago, and I think before I joined, they were in East London, and it was a different office, but they moved into 180 Strand, which is, Soho House is there, and TikTok and Charlotte Tilbury and all sorts of different creative companies. And it's become, and it has a sort of a communal working space in the lobby. And it's just full of young people and artists. And I say young people as if I'm old. I'm not old. And we are both not old. But it's very different from the physicality of my former life in the auction world at Sotheby's in Mayfair, where it's a lot older. The building, I mean, I know, David, that you've been to Sotheby's and come to the previews, but obviously very beautiful in the public spaces, but you go into the offices and it's a bit of a rabbit warren.
I have done that, believe me. I often tell students when I take them, this is like a swan, that you're seeing the beautiful swan gliding across the water. But downstairs in the engine rooms, it can be quite cramped and
Yeah. Now I look back,
wonderful in its own way. But that is the issue of working in a non-purpose-built auction house or other kind of art business, I guess. Whereas like Sotheby's New York is, of course, a kind of purpose-built building in many ways.
So different from Sotheby's London. But to answer your question, I mean, I love Mayfair. I mean, not for the sort of the tourist traffic on Oxford Street, but New Bond Street, where Sotheby's was. It was part of my day and my life. So those buildings and that kind of the mix of old and new is always really nice in London.
Sure. Yeah, and before we get into, you've already mentioned working at Frieze, and I didn't put that in. I'll put it on the introduction, obviously, to the podcast. But yeah, that's your job at the moment is with Frieze Art Fair, and we'll come to that later on. But any musical interests before we move on to your professional life?
Musical interests.
Any particular favorite music that you would take to the island?
Oh, I love that podcast. Well, not as much as I love your podcast, David, but I love the island. Gosh, I would say that my music tastes, much like maybe my art, my taste in art is eclectic, and it depends on my mood. I love jazz, Herbie Hancock, Sonny Rollins.
Yeah.
I have a playlist called Cantaloupe Jazz on Spotify that is a mix of sort of old school jazz. I think it was, I called it Cantaloupe Jazz after Herbie Hancock's song. So
Cool.
jazz, when I was in California, in the Bay Area, when I was at university, started listening to a lot of R&B and hip hop, 90s hip hop. So I have that too when I'm feeling particularly sort of reflective. I also listen to country sometimes. But yeah, Maggie Rogers is an artist that I think is great. I listened to a talk with her and Questlove, who's the drummer for The Roots. I
Mhm.
like him too. He has a great YouTube talk series, which I recommend. He's great.
Yeah.
And there was someone else. I think it was Olivia Dean. I think she's
Mm.
a young British singer.
Mhm.
I think that's her name. I'm listening to her too.
Do you ever get to go to live jazz in London, for example?
You know, I think one of the last things I did before the pandemic was to take my mother, who was visiting London for her birthday. I took her to Ronnie Scott's,
Fantastic.
which, yeah, which, as you know, has been around for a while. My parents used to live in London many, many moons ago. Before I was born, they would go. So I took her there.
Mm. Down in
But
Soho, Dean Street.
yeah, Dean Street.
Yeah. Is it Dean Street or is it Greek? I can never remember those streets. Is it the
It's
Greek
either Greek
Street?
Street or Dean Street,
It's one
but
of them.
I one Soho House on both of them,
It's
not where I go to.
opposite the equally famous Bar Italia, which is it's a little Italy in London, really. That cafe, it's great down
I
there.
should probably remember, but every time I go, it's dark. I probably had a big glass of wine. I don't.
Absolutely, yeah, I know exactly. And then maybe not asking you what your favorite work of art is, because I always think that's a bit of a naff question. I hate being asked that. It's like being asked about music, because your mood changes. Today I feel like going to the National Gallery. Tomorrow I want to go to some cutting edge like installation somewhere in Hackney or wherever. But maybe what we could ask you, leading on to the rest of the discussion, is do you have memories of suddenly realizing that you love visual art?
Yeah, yeah. I do, and it's and I'm not even looking back and creating the story. I remember it very well. I went to a British high school in Kuwait. So, as a lot of your listeners might know, or maybe the international students won't be as familiar, but I did GCSEs or IGCSEs because I was abroad, and I did fine art. And I remember putting together a portfolio, and that was when I discovered the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, and I think it was really it was in the works of Gauguin, Degas, Matisse, all of the sort of the typical, the big names that really made me fall in love with art, and just sort of, I think my mom still has a portrait I did of myself in the style of Matisse, or
Oh,
yeah, no, she still hasn't. She's like, she shows everyone. She's like, oh, that's my favorite. And, and then they'd say, oh, who is that? And then she would, as a typical mom would do. So it was in them. It was Degas. I loved his ballerinas. I loved his pastels. I loved the brushstrokes. Yeah. So that's when I knew I loved art. Um, and then, yeah. And then I went through a phase where I thought I didn't have the soul of an artist. So I decided to go into pre-med and medical stuff. So, but that's a whole separate
oh, I didn't
conversation.
know. I didn't know you had that side to you. And no, I think impressionism and post-impressionism is quite that's quite a standard way, I think, when people first respond to art, because it seems to appeal to young minds as well as sort of more connoisseur type
Yeah,
minds, but perhaps more so than old masters, where you've got that kind of knowledge gap, that we're not brought up learning Bible story, or most of us aren't brought up learning Bible
I
stories,
certainly wasn't in
mythologies.
Kuwait.
You did.
Well, I
You
mean, no,
didn't?
I was saying
I
I
was going to say, sorry, I thought you were in some kind of Judeo-Christian community in Kuwait or whatever. Yeah, no,
radar.
no, that's interesting. And what about contemporary art then? Because I mean, obviously that's like what we call dead art at the Institute. We probably shouldn't use that phrase, but what about living art? You know, living artists and ultra contemporary. And there's been a big shift,
Yeah.
of course, in the art market in the last couple of years towards what we now have to call ultra contemporary. Very, very young artists like Flora Yuknovich being boosted into the $1 million plus sales.
Yeah. Or Salman Tour, a Pakistani artist, you
Yeah,
know, you see
absolutely. Yeah.
his sales of it's just insane how quickly
Yeah.
they've
But can
skyrocketed.
you remember your first like cutting edge difficult art exhibition that you went back to your friends and said, "Oh wow, there's this really cool exhibition. It's really difficult, but I loved it."
You know, it's funny because again, not this podcast isn't about my mother's influence on me and my art career or my sensibilities, but growing up in Kuwait at the time that I grew up, I mean, a lot of people were interested in art. There were a couple of spaces, you know, an incredible collection of Islamic art, but of course that's not ultra contemporary. And, you know, one of the first galleries in the Gulf was actually, you know, founded in Kuwait in 1969, but really the spaces were few and far between. But my mother, who was always interested in supporting young artists and collecting, would go to Tehran a lot. And you know, she would bring back pieces. We would go in the summers. And that's when I think my understanding of, you know, contemporary art, living artists, and getting excited about art in a different way really took off, because you're sort of, you know, that they exist. Maybe you meet them and you see that they're sort of, you know, they're producing in real time. But as far as crazy conceptual difficult art, there wasn't that much of it in Kuwait. Um and we traveled a lot, of course we did, but yeah, I don't remember. And to be honest, call me a traditionalist, and I probably shouldn't say this. I work at Frieze, so and it's, you know, contemporary culture and, you know, sort of cutting edge artists, which I'm so interested in on a conceptual level. But I've always loved the kind of technical physicality of art. And I've only ever been able to fall in love with conceptual pieces when I meet the artist, because I think when you know the kind of history and the narrative behind it, it just opens up a whole different world.
No, I totally get that. And you know, I've had to do some introductions to exhibitions from some of these emerging, these ultra contemporary artists down at JD Mallet. I did a couple of podcasts with the artists and JD himself, who I noticed has just got a show of those artists, people like Kojo Bartho and Georgiana Dimmock. They're being shown in Mexico, in the art fair in Mexico. I can't quite remember its name. It's got a strange name, which I can't remember, or Moco or something like that. But it looks so exciting, and it reminds me that how up and coming Mexico is, I think, in terms of future art world, you know, development. That's really good.
I know a lot of people that are there, and I keep on seeing my news feed on Instagram with various colleagues and friends that have flown to Mexico City for the fair. And as you know, Frieze LA is coming up, and while I'll be missing the fair in Mexico, I will be in Mexico City at the end of February for about a week. And so I'll report back, but a lot of exciting things to see in Mexico. You're right. A lot of people are going there, and
yeah, I'm afraid I've still never been to Mexico, not through not wanting to, but just time, you know. So coming back to your stuff, you know, then moving into out of being a potential fine artist yourself, in your education in Kuwait, and then maybe doing some like medical studies, and then coming to London. What made you decide to come and do the MA Art Business then in Sotheby's Institute in London?
Well, that's a great question, and it was really considered rather than a sort of, you know, random choice. And not to say that people make this choice casually to do an MA in art business. It's very specific. As you touched on, David, I I went to a university and in California, Stanford, which is known for its sort of, more of the tech side of things. It's not necessarily a liberal arts school in the US that's focused on humanities, although I would say that it excels on both sides, left and right brain. And but at the time I'd done A levels, and my A levels were purely in the sciences and mathematics, because I thought I was going to medical school. Because I decided, before then, that I didn't have the soul of an artist, even though I painted and did portraiture and I illustrated a couple of books. But I did that, and I focused on the human side of health, so psychology and sort of anthropology as well, and worked, as most people at Stanford University do after graduating. They either go into consultancy work or they work at a tech startup. And I worked at a small startup in Menlo Park. And while I learned so much and was privileged enough to be with, incredibly smart people, I realized that I wanted a vocation. I wanted not an unhealthy work-life balance, but a life and a profession where I was interested in it beyond the sort of 9 to 5, so to speak. And I took a break. I went back to the Middle East for a couple of months to sort of reorient myself and have a moment to reflect. And I had this big grid of all the different industries and sectors and roles. Everything from retail, fashion, interior design, graphic design, and auction house. And Sotheby's Institute was on my mind because they had actually come to my university and had done one of those info sessions. And I remember speaking to my family and thinking, I don't know if this is for me. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't really understand what the options were in the industry beyond being a curator or working at a museum or a gallery. I didn't really understand what it meant to work in the art business. But maybe it was slightly, it was a process of elimination, maybe, and realizing what I didn't want to do, and then really taking a leap of faith, in that, I couldn't know anything or everything for certain, but I knew what I liked doing, and I knew that I liked both the sort of the creative side of the art business, but also the more technical and strategic side. I also knew that after having spent a couple of months back in Kuwait and with people that were, sort of from the, based in the country and had maybe gone back after studies, that there was a lot happening in the region. And I went to university as an undergraduate in 2007, and that was really the boom where all those headline, art headlines were coming out, whether it was the museums or, the Cezanne card players that were being purchased by the royal family.
Oh yes, by Middle Eastern guys, yeah.
Yeah, so it was sort of in that period when I was away, and frankly, it was a bit of a bubble in Palo Alto. I was incredibly removed from the art world and what was happening in the art market as it related to the Middle East and the Gulf specifically. But going back, 4 years later, it sounds like it wasn't that long, but a lot of things changed. The cultural landscape in Kuwait changed. So all this to say, I was interested in the region. I was interested in, being a mixed kid myself. I grew up in Kuwait, and I'm half Iranian and half Pakistani, with, very lucky to have British and American nationality. And but I felt really committed to the region, and the program to me was a great way to orient myself and to understand the market. And it focused me. And yeah, and then, we have a home in London. I was born here, and the program was great. I looked at all the professors. I think you actually interviewed me all those years ago, in Bedford Square. I was very intimidated.
I think I remember. There's been a lot of water gone under the bridge. No, of course I remember. Yeah, very impressed I was. We're going to flatter one another throughout.
Oh yeah. It's a very Middle Eastern thing to do, to be overly generous and
Yeah, it's
overly.
okay. I can do with a bit of that, to be honest. You don't often get it.
But yeah, and
And one of the things I was going to say is that when my son was at his secondary school in West London, it was kind of related to, there was a side, it was a boys' school, but it was very much related to the girls' school next door, like LEH, Lady Ellen Hollis and Inigo. My son was at Hampton School, and they knew one, they used to socialize together. He still goes out with LEH girls, and boys. But it was very interesting, this actually, for our listeners, because people often ask, why are there not more males? And I know we shouldn't really talk about gender anymore, but we still do. Why are there not more men on your course, on your MA Art Business? It's got the word business in it. You might expect, and so many people at the top of that world are male still, although I think our course has done a lot to change that. And my response to that is that I think there's quite a lot of inverse sexism against boys doing art history. So, we have this thing about girls doing science subjects, as not doing science subjects, but you went down that route. But that's relatively unusual, or used to be, and probably still is. And my son wanted, he thought seriously about doing history of art, because he came to when he was little, he came to the Beautiful Inside My Head Forever preview with the Dana Hurst. He loved it. They were getting out miniature ice creams to the kids in the previews. He loved that. And he thought about it, but he couldn't, it wasn't offered in the boys' school, whereas it was in LEH, the girls' school next door. And they didn't have like an exchange that you think that they might have had at sixth form level. So that is my answer to that, is that I think girls, if I can say, are encouraged to do more art than boys, and therefore we tend to get a lot of women, signing up for MA Art Business compared to men. I honestly think it's to do with a kind of discriminatory aspect of the education, and yet paradoxically, there's a lot of men when you get into art business, as you will know. But I think that's changing a lot,
yeah.
What was your? Can you remind us of your dissertation? Coming back to MA Art Business, so just for the listeners, it's a typical MA where you do 2 semesters with assignments and core units on international art, world art, business, finance, management, for example. There are electives, and then you do a researcher dissertation. And the MA Art Business dissertation is unusual. In fact, I was introducing it to this year's cohort yesterday. It's very unusual in as much as there's a lot more primary research involved, because no one has studied this subject, and no one is studying the subject really pretty much other than us. So how did your choice of dissertation come about, and what was it?
Wow, it's taking me down memory lane.
I bet you can't even remember, can you?
Well, you know what? I'm lucky, because I was actually at the Institute this week on Monday, speaking to the students, and we did a double lecture on the Middle Eastern art market. And, we can, again, that's an entirely separate conversation. What is the Middle Eastern art market? Is it the sort of the market locally? Is it about Middle Eastern art? It's sort of this blanket term that a lot of people use. But anyway, my interest when I started the program was in a way that maybe it wasn't when I was an undergrad. I wasn't necessarily as focused, because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life at 18. But when I was in the program, I decided to be very focused and considered. So my interest was in the Middle Eastern local market and what was happening there, the cultural ecosystem rather, and specifically the Gulf Arab states. So, the UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. I think I mentioned all of them. But I was interested in what was happening there. So it was Middle East focused. However, what I was most interested in, and I had read a couple of dissertations in the library at the Institute of people that had looked at the Middle Eastern art market, and it was all very interesting. But to me, it was such a young region that, researching sales results and what the auction houses had been doing, both locally and internationally, wasn't as interesting to me. That looking at sales figures wasn't that interesting. There were only so many assumptions you could make, and there were only so many trends you could deduce from a few years. So what I wanted to do was to take a market in a region that I was incredibly passionate about and invested in, but look for ways to understand it that could be, taken beyond just the region. And I was lucky to be supported in my dissertation and really encouraged to think outside of the box by Anna Dempster, who was a lecturer at the time. And we sort of broadened my initial interest in the region and looking at growth markets, you can call it emerging markets, developing markets, and to understand how we can responsibly and more accurately understand what growth means, sustainable growth. So I ended up it was a dual approach. It was, understanding the Middle East and the specificities of the region, but also looking at ecological theory. So that seems, it was a bit ambitious and maybe sort of subconsciously pulled from my kind of more scientific or science background from my undergrad, my years as an undergrad. So I looked at ecological theory and how scientists would measure the health of an ecosystem. So diversity, variance, and all these sort of biological terms that I cannot be quizzed on right now because I will not be able to accurately talk about. But essentially, I created a model. It was sort of quite analytical to measure art ecosystem resilience. So how do we understand and measure resilience in an ecosystem in order to truly or sort of more accurately reflect sustainable growth or understand sustainable growth?
And as far as you know, has anyone ever applied that ecological theory from a completely different discipline to the art world, to the art market?
No, no, they hadn't. I think at least not, certainly not then. I'd done so much research. It was 2013, 2014. No one had done it. And you'll see in articles and in conversations in our industry, people talk about an ecosystem a lot more now.
Yes.
I remember in 2013 and 2014, that language wasn't as commonly used. And that was really the way to approach it, because there was so much more to an art market than just the market in the way that maybe people were talking about it. It was an ecosystem. It's not just the auction house sales figures. And, I was in an auction house for 7 years, and it can tell you some of what's happening in the art world, but it's really just a small, tip of the iceberg, really.
Definitely. So you just mentioned, Aryana, that something that we were going to come on to next, maybe we will now. You worked in an auction house for 7 years. This was presumably Sotheby's in New Bond Street, where I know, because I used to bring students down at your invite to take them on previews of like Middle Eastern art shows and Asian art shows. So do you want to talk, how did you get that opportunity, and do you want to say something about your experience of working in the Middle East?
Again, I want to preface by saying, it is timing, it's opportunity in this industry when things come up sometimes. But again, it seemed that everything aligned in this moment. Edward Gibbs, who's the chairman of the Middle East and India at Sotheby's, he had actually given a guest lecture in our program. And I remember thinking to myself, again, I grew up in Kuwait, and I knew the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya, which has this incredible Islamic art collection, as I said at the very beginning, one of the best in the world. And Edward had mentioned it, and I sort of was still a young student, so was a bit more brave than I usually would have been, and I stepped up and had a conversation with him after he presented his lecture, and I asked him about Sotheby's, and I sort of was about to walk off stage, but I turned around and I said, "Edward, do you have any opportunities in the department?" And he said, "Well, yes, let me connect you with you know, Alexandra Roy, who, by the way, is still in the department, and she's moved on from working on the Islamic art sales to the modern and contemporary sales, and she's absolutely amazing. And had a conversation with her, did a 3-month internship with Sotheby's as I was writing my dissertation, which was a lot at the time, and was lucky enough to get into their graduate training program. So at the time, Sotheby's ran this program which took in 6 to 7 grads, and we were basically trained across the business. And after that, again, was lucky enough to get a full-time role in the Middle East department. And it was at a time where the company was expanding their activity in the region. We opened up a Sotheby's Dubai office in 2016, 2017, and our Middle Eastern art sales were resumed in London. And yeah, so it was a busy time for the region and for the Middle East department. And I got a full-time job, and I was there for up until a year and a half ago, almost. Yeah.
And what languages do you have, Aryana?
I wish I could say I speak Arabic. I can read it because we were all taught how to read the alphabet in the Middle East, or in Kuwait rather. But I will say that living in Kuwait and in the Gulf generally doesn't make learning Arabic as easy as you would think. I think if you lived in Lebanon or Egypt or Jordan even, you'd pick it up. But I'm half Iranian. My mother's Iranian, so I can understand and speak Farsi with a very accent, you know, heavy Americanized accent. But it can certainly be.
What's the language of choice in Kuwait? English?
A lot of people speak English. Yeah, I mean Arabic, yes, but you know, there's a huge expat community in places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And actually, I would have friends when I was at university, and one in particular who came to visit me in Kuwait. His name is Andrew, and he was studying Arabic at Stanford, and it was before the war in Syria, and they would actually send students to Syria to learn Arabic. And he came to Kuwait and thought, every time I open my mouth and try to say something at a cafe, they all respond to me in English and laugh.
Yeah. It's very frustrating. I've had that in Italy when I was studying. They're all trying to practice their English, and I try to practice my But did it help in that job, having a little bit of understanding of Arabic, or do you think it helped more that you understood the culture?
I mean, I think having languages in the auction house always really, really helpful. I think, you know, having an understanding of, at least my experience of the culture, was the most important thing, and having connections, understanding how things worked, and sort of nuance and all of that, and maybe having, you know, a network of, you know, knowing the institutions, knowing the people, knowing the players.
The ecosystem, to come back to your dissertation term.
Ecosystem. Yeah. And I think things are constantly evolving, but you know, non-Middle Eastern buyers would participate in our sales, but equally, you know, at the beginning of any sort of growing and new market, it's people like to buy their own. So Lebanese collectors like to buy Lebanese art. Typically Iranian collectors kind of gravitate to Iranian art first. So knowing, having a connection to those cultural communities does help, and getting how collectors, there's a certain, I mean, we would joke, knowing how to deal with Middle Eastern clients compared to other clients. You know, there was a difference. They're all sort of across the board quite similar, I guess, but there were certain cultural traits maybe that would have benefited people to know when they started working in our department.
And for the benefit of some of the listeners, where we talk about Sotheby's offices, what we really mean is they have an outlet there, but it's not an auction house. And I know that, you know, I think listeners might be quite interested in, you know, we do hear of auctions by the big auction houses, like almost like pop-up auctions in Middle Eastern centres like Dubai every now and then. But generally speaking, the big Middle Eastern sales are actually take place in London.
Yeah.
But why is that? Why London, and why? Because this is a question we're always asked, obviously, on the course. You know, why is London such a hub, and people would buy and sell art there rather than in locally?
Yeah. Well, Christie's started selling locally in Dubai,
Yeah.
um, and still do. For us, I think, our first Middle Eastern art sales, and there was actually a mix. It was a cross category. There were a few cross category sales. Were in Doha, in Qatar, before, I think in 2013, around that time, sort of, much earlier, and before I started with the team. But London, there's always been a connection with London and the Middle East. A lot of our clients and buyers and collectors have bases in London. It's incredibly international. For us, I think having our sales based in London was the best choice because it's sort of neutral ground, a little bit. And so many people have second homes here. And yeah, so it worked. And it also was a way for us to give our artists, and I say our artists, artists from the region that we would include in our sales, a platform, a global platform. So it actually was really great to have the sale in London, because we'd have these exhibitions, ahead of every auction. You'd have the views on in the galleries downstairs, and it was a way to expand the audience, actually, and to have modernists and contemporary artists who are originally from the Middle East being shown to this incredibly cosmopolitan city. And that was a selling point too for clients and consigners and for artists. They loved that, and I thought that was great, and it was sort of opening up the market as well. We did have a couple of auctions in Dubai. When we opened up our Dubai office in, I think it was, well, we were working on it in 2016. I think we officially launched and opened in 2017. And we opened with a boundless sale. So it was a cross-category sale in Dubai, which was incredible. It was such a beautiful sale that my colleague Ashkan had put together, where we, again, didn't want to just put together an auction that was solely on Middle Eastern art, because we realized that the region was so much more than just that, as in people were interested in art, across many, many different categories. But we thought we would put together a sale that had a connection to the region. So it was artists that had been inspired by the region, artists from the region. There were design pieces. I remember this massive Zaha Hadid table in our offices. We had an Ali Bani Sad. We had a Boeti, and the sale did incredibly well. But what we ended up doing afterwards was we put together 2 auctions in the luxury category, so in watches, and then actually realized, because of what was needed and sort of, what was happening in the rest of the business, that we would actually focus the Dubai office on selling exhibitions, non-selling exhibitions, and not necessarily continue with the auctions that we were putting together, for various reasons. And I think it's important to trial and test and do different things in a new office. But I think we only held those 2 watches sales, and then that was it. And I'm not really sure what their plan is for auctions now, since I'm not with them anymore. I could definitely ask, but I don't know.
Can you explain what you mean by cross category? Do you mean from different nations, different media?
So that's a good question. So we worked with the entire, sort of different departments in Sotheby's offices globally. So the New York office, the London office, and we worked with them to put together a sale. So when I say cross category, I mean, we worked with the design department, for example, to source the Zaha Hadid table. We worked with prints. We worked with the impressionist team, all sorts of, all our different.
Because you thought that would appeal to a quite eclectic taste, international taste of Middle Eastern buyers of art and luxury.
Why exactly? And I think we were also seeing that people that weren't necessarily from the Middle East were moving to Dubai, and also people, the collectors there, their tastes, you know, were they had been buying in contemporary and impressionists, and we wanted to reflect the sophisticated tastes of our clients, and that it wasn't as simple as just because, and you know, it was maybe also and educating in ways to sort of the market and our colleagues that, you know, people based in the Middle East weren't, you know, weren't necessarily just collecting Middle Eastern art. It was so much more than that. You know, and following that, we had traveling exhibitions, and what we typically do, or what we typically did, and they continue to do, are travel the highlights from various sales to different offices in globally, and offices that don't necessarily host and hold the big auctions that you see. So we had incredible old master paintings come to Dubai for the first time, actually, in the region.
And of
And
course, the Leonardo da Vinci Salvator Mundi, which is now a world record at auction for a painting, that sold to a Middle Eastern buyer. And also, earlier in my days at the Institute, 2002, I think it was, Christie's sold what was then a world record, which was an ancient Greco-Roman Venus. You may remember I did a lecture on it because I wrote a chapter in one of our Institute books about it called the Jenkins Venus. That was bought by Sheikh Saldar Thani of Qatar. And it was, what was interesting about that was how exotic that Western mythological character and a nude female. I don't know if it's even on display yet in Qatar, but it was part of an international museum idea, I think, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just so interesting, and it was so wonderful to get the opportunity to do those lectures with the students on Monday, because having not been kind of deep in sort of all things Middle East and what was happening, what is happening in the region, sort of thinking back on what happened, and you know, whether it's sort of these big pieces that have been acquired and taken back to the Middle East, or you know, what continues to happen. You know, Jeff Koons did his first retrospective in the Middle East in Doha, and he has this massive public sculpture. I haven't seen it in the flesh. It looks typically like you'd imagine a big Koons. I think it's a whale. I'm not really sure what it is.
Like the puppy in Bilbao by the Guggenheim, yes. The huge puppy made of flowers. And then anyway, I'm aware of time, and I know we both have appointments in quarter for now. So I guess the listeners will probably also want to know about your current job. I mean, we could talk forever about Middle East, and what Aryana has just referred to. It doesn't mean that she's like a full-time academic lecturer, but she was a guest lecturer. We invited her to talk about the Middle Eastern market on one of our business courses, where we look at different national markets. So I know I've already got very good feedback from the students about that, and one student saying that she wants to do her assignment comparing Middle Eastern with. I think she's reached out to you actually for some help, because there are issues with data which we won't go into now. But you know, the art market, as everybody knows, kind of generally lacks transparency, but data for Middle Eastern, because as you say, they're selling exhibitions rather than public auctions a lot of the time. So the data can be harder to kind of isolate for individual Middle Eastern countries. But coming now on to Frieze. So Frieze Art Fair, you know, started in London in 2003, has grown both in London and internationally. And Aryana now has this wonderful job at Frieze, working on the Frieze 91 VIP club, if you like, which people subscribe to. And maybe you could say something about who are the people who join that club, and is it useful for them to know one another? And then I think most excitingly, you've just launched, literally last night, I signed up for an app for Frieze.
Yeah, and you were an early signer. You were an early.
I was an early signer. Yeah, and I'm terrible technologically, so I was kind of, you know, getting my email wrong, and then the password.
I'm so happy to see your selfie pop up on the app. So thank you for signing up. It's open to everyone as of today, actually. So we were sort of, you know, on the phone with the developers early this morning. So that's been a whole other adventure. But yeah, I and the segue is maybe a nice one from talking about the Middle East and going into Frieze to start to work with them on sort of really building this new initiative. And to me, it was my interest in new markets, developing new audiences, and reaching an entirely new generation of collectors and art lovers and patrons, whatever it is that one would like to call them. So Frieze 91.
Millennials and Gen Z are increasingly entering those high-end markets. So I've been working on that recently for a report I'm doing. It's fascinating, yeah. So that there is a lot of wealth, I think, amongst younger art collectors as well.
Exactly, and I think I'll go on to sort of give a very brief kind of overview on what Frieze 91 is, but I think it's so important in our industry as it's shifting. I think we're in an inflection point where museums are looking at their collections differently. They're understanding that it's increasingly, the audience is intercultural, intergenerational. There's this new wave of people that are coming in, and we really, in order to kind of keep this, going back to the ecosystem, alive and healthy, we need to think about how we continue to sort of feed it. And it can't just be sort of targeting and reaching out to the same people. Galleries can't, continue to reach out to the same clients, auction houses, etc. And the fairs need new audiences and new sort of clients. But Frieze 91 was really born out of a desire to engage with communities year round, and communities being the galleries and the institutions that we work with, or the people that come to our fairs that really love, getting to know what's going on in the sort of arts and cultural space more deeply. So it's a group of people that I would say are, that are art lovers, buyers, collectors at various levels. And I don't want to sort of, I feel like sometimes the word collectors is a bit, it's not as inclusive, because what does it mean to be a collector? Let's be honest, the price points at Frieze aren't necessarily always and that often that accessible, but you can buy at a sort of lower, more modest level, but still be a collector. In my opinion, it shouldn't just be the number of zeros that you're purchasing at. So
I'm really a collector. And there aren't that many zeros on the works I buy, I can tell you.
It should be about that. And and also people are collecting, but are busy working professionals, that don't have time to go to the Tuesday collectors luncheon. They're working 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. and but they're hungry and they want to go to galleries. They want to support artists. And this program is young in that it's only a year and a half old. But it's really about building a program that's global, connecting London, New York, LA, and we're launching and rolling it out in Seoul in the spring. And it's about creating ways where we can support our galleries year round, as in plan artist studio visits, and connect an audience, so our members who want to get to know these galleries but don't really have the bandwidth to kind of scour the internet and figure out what galleries they should be looking at or shouldn't be looking at. So yeah, it's really it's for a new generation, and it's to make it accessible to a degree, but also make it a community. And it sounds a little bit cheesy to talk about community and fuzzy and loving, but really it is about that. It's how can we make give you the art world so you feel like it's sort of at your fingertips. And with this app, which is really exciting, it's a way for the community to connect. So for us it was, we would meet all these incredible members that are either interested in NFTs or have their own galleries or collecting young artists, and I'll hear something and I'll realize that someone based in LA has very similar interests, but how do we connect them? And it should be about that too. And what's great about what we do at Frieze is that we're not selling the art. We're not, we're really just trying to create this really powerful creative community that can draw kind of energy from itself. So yeah, it's all new. It's all very exciting, and I hope that it is additive for everyone, for galleries, for institutions, for collectors, yeah,
Yeah, and
the
were there just something about the structure of the app? Is it using things like algorithm? Did you bring in kind of like expert people to design it? And
yeah.
what kind of questions and what kind of things did you ask them to make it do?
So it's a company called the Dots. You may
Yes.
be familiar with them.
Well, I
And
had to sign up to that app. Yeah.
exactly. They have their own platform, which is sort of, it's a professional networking
Yeah.
platform, more geared for people in the creative industries.
Mhm.
They also white label because their tech is so I'm is really great. They white label, so they work with clients like Apple, with
Mhm.
Soho Works,
Mhm.
I think UAL possibly. So for us, it was about how do we create ways that we can connect with our clubs, call it
Mhm.
Frieze 91 Club, in more dynamic ways. Because right now, we have our newsletters, we have our website, but things change so quickly in our industry and in this world. You'll discover this opening that's happening next week. You'll see this great article, you'll want to post it. And it was a way for us to be able to be more dynamic and
Mhm.
fluid and fresh with our members, and to sort of not be as restricted with, the once a month kind of very traditional newsletter. So we wanted to be able to do that. We wanted our members to know who was in the community. We have an incredible committee of Frieze 91 leaders. So you may have seen that we hosted it was a really fun Christmas holiday. It was our holiday party with Maro Itoje, who's a great
Yes,
collector.
I really wanted to come to that. He's one of my favorite rugby players, and we have an alumna, by the way, who photographs rugby, and
Really?
he's one of, she follows him, and he plays a lot,
Yeah, no.
which is why you invited him. Yeah,
Exactly. So he's on our committee, and he hosted our Freeze
fantastic.
91 holiday event. And it's sort of, we wanted these members to get to know our committee, and for us to be able to support the committee with all the various projects that they're working on. So Maro is one great example. Sophie
Great.
Ashby is an interior designer. She's also on our committee. Edeline Lee, I would say to everyone, if this podcast is live before Fashion Week in London, we supported her on her London Fashion Week show. So, she's
Mm.
become a dear friend now. But yeah, it was a way to get our members more familiar with our committee. Simon Fox, our CEO, is on the app. So if that's ever a reason to join the app and DM Simon Fox, our CEO, then you have that opportunity. I'm sure he'd respond. He's very responsive. And yeah, you can see he's going to events. What's really cool, actually, it's a bit geeky, but if you're going to the fair, it has a geolocator, so you can
Oh,
see who's
wow,
physically in the space and connect with people.
that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, so we're really excited. We'll have a
You'll
lot
get
more.
stalked by people. No, I think it's great. I think it's great. The bugs that you said that you've been fixing this morning, was it any? I mean, when it asked me when I was doing my profile, it asked, "What's your profession?" And I couldn't put in academic, lecturer.
Oh,
You
really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in the end, I found author, which was probably about as close as I could get. So I don't know
Well,
why
thank
it was, but obviously there's
no,
going to be a few bugs like that in it.
exactly. So we were actually just speaking about this, where we want either our members to be able to create their own tags, or for
Yeah.
them to increase the number of tags that
Mm.
are available. My brother asked a similar. He is a member. He is a paying member of Freeze 91. He is a He's a macro trader in New York, so he's an FX trader. And I get this very sort of abrupt message on WhatsApp saying, "Why do I have to put in my profession? And why is there no option for financial trader?" And I
Yeah.
had to sort of speed
Well,
that up
tell
to,
him that there's nothing for academic either. They're obviously not expected to be art collectors, but they don't pay us enough. Whereas for him, he's certainly someone who should be on the list. Oh,
I
and
have that.
Aryana, before I forget, Freeze 91, the name for our listeners.
So Freeze 91 is, so while we started our fairs a little bit later, as you said, David, the Freeze started off a magazine. It was a
Yeah.
publication, an incredible publication that was launched in London by Amanda Sharp and Matthew Slotover, and it was started in 1991. So I guess in a way it's quite poetic. Frieze 91, you know, started off as this, you know, it wasn't a commercial art fair at all, and it was really about championing contemporary artists and contemporary culture. And in this way, you know, with Frieze 91, which is our community and a year-round membership program, it's really, you know, it's to be able to kind of maybe re-energize that belief, which is still very much, you know, part of the fabric of Frieze and continues to be our lifeblood. But it's really to kind of, you know, breathe life into, you know, the kind of starting point. So yeah.
Yeah, I was reading some recent wealth reports, which are incredibly expensive to buy, so you can access them in the business centre at the British Library for free. And one interesting thing they were saying about millennials and Gen Z is that there's a much greater interest in, they want to invest in things they really believe in, not just for financial investment. They're more philanthropic, more giving. And it seems to me that this coincides with the creation of this Frieze 91 group, that these are people who aren't just in it for kind of like financial investment. They really are in it, as you said earlier, because they're really genuinely interested culturally and philanthropically in supporting emerging artists, and you know, which you obviously do by purchasing works at Frieze art fairs.
And I think yes, of course, it's purchasing artworks from artists to allow them to have, you know, a livelihood. But really, it's also, you know, there are smaller ways to support artists as well. I mean, buying their art for sure, but to be able to being part of this program allows us to sort of program, you know, studio visits, visit artists, get them more visible, write about them, do videos, recordings, share their work, give them a, you know, a broader reach. But, you know, it's sort of, it's in all those different ways too. And yeah, so I hope that this, I mean, again, it's early days, but I really think that we're at a really exciting point in our industry, as you said, where there's this new wave of people that are interested in being slightly more maybe philanthropic, have a belief in supporting ecosystems and what's happening. And hopefully, you know, we're just going to continue to go from strength to strength. We're growing quite quickly now. And yeah, we're building our team. So we're getting bigger internally as well. So,
and of course, this year, for the first time, the MA Art Business students at the Institute in London are members. We've signed them all up to be Frieze VIP.
Can I say that, I mean, it was almost serendipitous. I mean, I don't know, the fact that there are 91 students from the MA program in Frieze
91 for Frieze 91. It's great, isn't it? And I'm pretty certain it was in the early days when I was at the Institute, teaching classical art at the start, not art business. But I attended a lecture on this new art business MA, because it interested me. That I think it was probably Michael Slotover who was talking about the magazine, and now he's saying it doesn't make any money. We're lucky to have people who put money into it because of the idea of great contemporary art being produced, particularly in the UK, you know. And I think it was probably him, but someone certainly came along, and I felt really sorry for them. I thought, oh God, you know, this is a great magazine, but they're obviously, you know, you haven't got any money, and so that's quite interesting what that has grown into now in many ways. We're not going to have time, but maybe we could do another podcast at some point, because Aryana is actively visiting these recent Frieze editions in places like Seoul in South Korea, and she's about to go to LA, which I think will be its second edition.
No, it's actually, so I went for
it's older than that, isn't it? Yeah,
2019.
Yeah, it's older. I was going to say Frieze is older than that.
But it's jumped around. It was in Paramount, as far as locations, it was in Paramount Studios
in the film studios.
Last year, and now we're in Santa Monica Airport, which is a new venue, much bigger.
It's changed, because I know there were a few issues last year with the Paramount Studios, however glamorous and one level and cultural it was. So maybe we could do another podcast for your experiences just from Seoul and LA in the future. But
there's so much to talk about. I mean, you know, LA, we're all off to LA tomorrow, which is crazy. I have not
Having
packed
just
my.
launched and I know you're going to have a party as an official launch of the app.
We're going to have a very fun, very cool party in LA on Friday, next Friday, so a week from today. And we'll have it at the Edition Hotel, which is a really, swanky, fun hotel in LA. And we've got this great DJ. He does vinyl only. So any of the, and that's what I should have said actually when you asked me about music. I had been put in touch with this DJ who does vinyl only, and he's great. And we've actually, another part of what we're doing and rolling out with Frieze 91 is we're going to curate soundtracks to the fair. So we've worked with DJ Jahari Terry, for anyone that's interested. And he's put together a playlist that's very LA. He's based in LA. He grew up in Oakland, in California, in the Bay Area. So the soundtrack will really reflect the city, which is a lot. Christine, our fair director, does so much, outside, sort of in parallel with the fair, to engage, local LA-based communities and arts organizations. So it sort of goes beyond the fair and the commercial galleries that we support and we champion. So it's all about galvanizing the creative ecosystem. And I look forward to, I've been listening to this soundtrack to get me pumped and excited for the fair. So he'll be DJing at that party.
Put the link on the app and I'll take a listen.
It'll also be on Frieze Connect, so you can there.
And I wish I had time to fly over just for the party.
I know. It'll be a fun party, 8 to 10. If anyone wants to go, just let me know. Find me on Instagram, and I'll make sure you're on the list.
I remember driving down Sunset Boulevard when I was asked to go out by the Institute to set up the LA Institute, which I set it up, but it lasted a few years, and then for various reasons it's closed down now. But I remember driving out there in this wonderful hire car, driving along there, thinking I was Richard Gere, going to the Malibu.
I see the resemblance.
No, not at all. And actually, one other thing, while I think about it, I referred to an alumna who photographs rugby, and of course, she was one of my guests. Dong Min Kim was actually one of my guests on the podcast. So we were talking about photographing rugby. So and I know Maro Toji is one of her heroes. So she would have been very. I didn't tell her. I nearly sort of DM'd her to say, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to see Toji with this sort of Frieze. Can I come?" So.
Well,
anyway,
we're hoping to do a few more things with Maro this year. I know he's busy playing rugby right now. But
not doing too well actually at the moment.
Oh, I know. I heard.
We lost to Scotland at Twickenham last week, so let's hope that
collecting and Frieze 91 to fall back on.
Yeah, and that thing also about the DJ and music and art. The last podcast I did with Milena Berman, she was talking about she has a wine company in Haute Côte in Bordeaux, and she does art, wine, and culture tours. And Milena was talking about how they did this really successful launch of getting hip hop artists to come and do the music for the wine tasting.
Oh, I'll definitely have to listen to that. And
that's very interesting. So she's mixed
connect with her. I should connect with.
You should connect with Milena. Yeah, it's very, very exciting. And she wasn't a London MA Art business student. She was we have this thing called a hybrid student, where I think she studied online and then came to London for a semester. And so but she's got this very interesting business. So listen to the last podcast as well. And then Dr. Min's one, the photographer from an earlier time. So anyway, you're in the line of a lot of very special.
12-hour flight to listen to all of your podcasts is what I will be
doing. No, anyway, thank you very much, Aryana Khan, for being my guest today, and have a great time in LA for Frieze LA, and don't stay up too late at the party. You'll probably be in the sunrise. I know it's called Hollywood Sunset, I think, the party, but I was thinking it'd probably be the sunrise as well. So hopefully the DJ will be playing some cool chill out music in the early later.
He'll start off he'll start off chill and he'll end up getting us all bouncing and, you know, whatever on the dance floor.
Pete Tong was at my school, and he used to do the disco, the school disco, believe it or not. I remember him doing it when he was 15, and that was really good fun. And little did I know that this guy would one day be the big DJ. You know, it's funny how these little seeds from your past sort of grow into these things. You know. Anyway, thank you very much, Aryana, and have a great time in LA.
Pleasure.